Before the plantations of the Americas, before the transatlantic slave trade, before the empires that thrived on human bondage, slavery had already shaped civilizations for thousands of years. But how did it all begin? The story of slavery does not begin in the 17th century. It does not even begin in the Roman arenas or the Egyptian quarries. It begins where civilization itself was born. Where the first great cities rose, so too did the practice of human ownership. It was not just accepted, it was engineered, built into the very foundations of society. And yet, despite its omnipresence, its origins remain shrouded in shadow. Today, we pull back the veil on one of humanity's oldest and darkest institutions. The truth is, slavery was not always about race. It was about conquest, about power, about survival in an unforgiving world. And before the Atlantic trade, before European ships scoured African shores, the machinery of human bondage had already been perfected for millennia. What if I told you that slavery was not just a tragic period in history, but one of the driving forces behind civilization itself? The great cities of antiquity, the first wonders of the world, were not just built on stone and ambition. They were built on flesh, on backs that labored beneath sun and lash, on hands that shaped the bricks, tilled the fields, forged the tools of empire. The roots of civilization are tangled with the chains of those who had no choice but to serve. The first civilizations didn't merely use slaves, they were shaped by them. Slavery was not an afterthought, nor an accident of history. It was an engine, a system perfected and refined over millennia, written into the very laws that govern these ancient worlds. To understand the rise of humanity, we must first understand its greatest contradiction, that the dawn of civilization was also the dawn of human bondage. The mechanics of slavery, a system of forced labor, human commodification, and social control. Slavery is often spoken about as a historical tragedy, a moral failing of past civilizations. But to understand slavery as a system, we must strip away the emotional weight and examine it for what it truly was. A calculated, highly structured machine designed to extract labor, generate wealth, and maintain social hierarchies through control and fear. At its core, slavery is the systematic extraction of labor without compensation, choice, or recourse. Unlike wage labor, where individuals trade time and skill for pay, enslaved people were given no agency. Their productivity was stolen, their bodies controlled, and their very existence reduced to a unit of production within an economic framework. This system was not chaotic or accidental. It was deliberately engineered. Slavery wasn't just about forced work. It was about optimized exploitation. In the American South, for example, enslaved people were assigned labor quotas, specific amounts of cotton to pick per day. If they fell short, they were whipped. If they exceeded expectations, quotas were raised the next day. This was a system of perpetual extraction, a cycle that ensured maximum economic output at the lowest cost. But forced labor alone does not define slavery. What made it truly insidious was its second key element, the commodification of human beings. The moment an enslaved person was captured, sold, or born into bondage, they ceased to exist as an individual in the eyes of the system. Instead, they became a financial asset, an entry in a ledger, a unit of capital. Enslaved people were bought and sold like livestock, with their value fluctuating based on age, health, and skill. Used as collateral for loans, banks in places like New Orleans and London allowed slave owners to mortgage their enslaved workers to finance plantations. Insured by financial institutions, policies were written not to protect the enslaved, but to reimburse owners for their lost investment if a slave died or escaped. The level of financial sophistication surrounding slavery was staggering. In 1836, almost 80% of the U.S. economy was directly tied to slave labor. Some of the world's largest financial institutions, like J.P. Morgan Chase, have historical records showing they once processed transactions where enslaved people were used as collateral. To the enslaved, this commodification was more than just financial. It was deeply dehumanizing. They were branded with hot irons like cattle. Families were torn apart at auction blocks. Women were forced into breeding programs to produce the next generation of laborers. In many societies, their names were stripped away, replaced with numbers or generic identifiers. But forced labor and commodification alone do not fully explain slavery's persistence. The system endured for millennia because of its third element: social control. Slavery could not survive through brute force alone. It required an intricate web of laws, propaganda, and psychological conditioning to justify its existence and prevent rebellion. Legal frameworks did more than just permit slavery. They ensured it was self-reinforcing. In the United States, the 1662 Virginia law codified that the status of a child followed the condition of the mother, partus sequitur ventrum. This meant that even if the father was free, if the mother was enslaved, the child was too, perpetuating slavery across generations. Laws also criminalized literacy among the enslaved, preventing them from reading or writing, which could lead to organized resistance. But social control wasn't just legal, it was deeply psychological. Religious justification: slave owners weaponized religion using passages from the Bible, the Quran, and other sacred texts to justify bondage. In Christian societies, they cited Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. In Islamic societies, rulers used interpretations of Surah An-Nisa 4:24, which permitted the taking of captives as a divine endorsement. Yet these same texts were also used by abolitionists to argue for freedom, racial pseudoscience. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scientific racism was used to argue that certain people were naturally suited for servitude. Prominent thinkers like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach classified humans into racial groups, falsely claiming that Africans were inherently inferior. These pseudoscientific claims gave intellectual cover to slavery, making it seem not just economically necessary, but biologically ordained. Fear and surveillance. Slave societies developed sophisticated surveillance and punishment mechanisms to keep enslaved people in line. Slave patrols, precursors to modern police forces, roamed the American South, searching for runaways and punishing those who resisted. Draconian punishments like public whippings, amputations, and executions served as deterrents. Psychological warfare. In some Caribbean plantations, enslaved people were forced to watch brutal executions to discourage rebellion. Perhaps the most insidious form of control was the manipulation of enslaved people's own identities. Slaveholders often renamed enslaved individuals, stripping them of their original names and replacing them with names from European culture, erasing their heritage. The psychological toll of being treated as property, of having one's history erased, of knowing that escape was nearly impossible, created a crushing sense of helplessness. But not everyone accepted this fate. Resistance, both overt and covert, was constant. From secret religious gatherings to subtle acts of sabotage, enslaved people found ways to defy their captors, proving that even in the most oppressive conditions, the human spirit refused to be broken. Slavery was not just a crime of the past. It was a meticulously engineered institution designed to be self-perpetuating. It survived not simply because of force, but because it wove itself into the economic, legal, and social fabric of civilizations. Unlike systems of indentured servitude, where laborers were eventually freed, enslaved status was inherited, ensuring a perpetual supply of free labor. In the Americas, enslaved women were often subjected to forced reproduction, either through coercion by their enslavers or through selective breeding programs designed to increase the labor force. By the early 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was banned in the United States, 1808, but slavery itself continued. This led to a domestic breeding industry, particularly in Virginia and Maryland, where enslaved people were deliberately bred and sold to plantations in the Deep South. Women were forced to bear multiple children, and their children were often sold before they reached adulthood. This created an internal economy of human capital, where enslaved people were no longer just laborers, they were investments. Banks and insurance companies played a key role in sustaining slavery. Slave owners took out policies on their enslaved workers, ensuring that if they died, the owner would be compensated. This reduced the financial risks of owning enslaved people and made slavery more attractive as a long-term investment. Slavery wasn't just a local institution, it was a global economic network. Wall Street and London's role. Many of the world's most powerful financial institutions, including some that still exist today, were built on the profits of slavery. Banks in London, New York, and Amsterdam provided loans for plantation expansion, using enslaved people as collateral. These loans funded entire economies, ensuring that slavery remained profitable. While slavery was concentrated in the American South, its economic benefits were felt everywhere. Northern textile mills, particularly in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, depended on cotton harvested by enslaved workers. These factories transformed raw cotton into finished goods, fueling the Industrial Revolution. The British Empire, too, relied heavily on slave-grown cotton from the American South, which supplied its massive textile industry in cities like Manchester and Liverpool. The Caribbean was a crucial node in the Atlantic slave economy. Sugar plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and Haiti produced enormous wealth, but at an unimaginable human cost. The sugar trade fueled European economies, creating a financial engine that linked Africa, the Americas, and Europe in a triangular flow of goods, money, and people. The longevity of slavery was not just economic, it was cultural. Societies built myths and ideologies to justify its existence. Even some of history's most celebrated thinkers, such as Aristotle, Voltaire, and Thomas Jefferson, made arguments in favor of slavery. Aristotle described some people as natural slaves, while Jefferson, despite writing about equality, enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime and believed black people were biologically inferior. These ideas shaped laws and policies, embedding slavery deep into the moral framework of society. Newspapers and literature romanticized slavery, portraying enslaved people as childlike and in need of guidance. Minstrel shows in the 19th century depicted enslaved people as happy and content, reinforcing the illusion that slavery was not cruel. Plantation culture was glorified in paintings, novels, and eventually films like Gone with the Wind, shaping how later generations viewed the past. Before empires, before kings, before written history, there was slavery. In the vast, untamed wilderness of early human civilization, power was survival, and dominance was the difference between life and death. Tribes clashed over hunting grounds, over scarce resources, over the right to exist. The victors of these battles didn't always kill their enemies. Some captives were spared, but only to serve. The first known instances of slavery weren't built on race or money. They were built on power and necessity. Long before the pyramids rose, before the first walls of a city were built, humans discovered something chilling. A defeated enemy was more useful alive than dead. This discovery would shape the next 10,000 years of history. But who were the first people to turn captivity into an institution? The answer lies in one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, Sumer, the first society built on slavery. Over 4,000 years ago, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians built the first great cities of mankind. Towering ziggurats, sprawling markets, the first written laws, all of it required labor, and labor required workers. But not all work was voluntary. The first recorded evidence of slavery comes from Sumerian clay tablets dating back to 3,100 BCE. These ancient records reveal a brutal reality. Men, women, and children were listed not as people, but as property. Some were war captives, taken after Sumerian armies crushed rival cities. Some were debtors, forced into servitude when they couldn't repay what they owed. Some were born into it, inheriting their parents' servitude like a curse they could never escape. For the first time in history, human life had a price. The first slave markets emerged, where people were bought, sold, and traded like cattle. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was business. But slavery in Sumer was just the beginning. Soon it would become the foundation of an empire so vast, it would change history forever. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as one of the most awe-inspiring monuments in human history. But for centuries, one question has haunted historians. Who built it? The traditional image, masses of slaves, backs broken under the Egyptian sun, whipped into submission, has been passed down through generations. But the truth is more complex. Not all pyramid builders were enslaved. Archaeological evidence reveals that skilled laborers, paid workers, constructed much of the pyramids. They lived in well-maintained workers' villages and even received rations of beer and bread. But alongside them were thousands of enslaved people, war captives, criminals, and peasants trapped in forced labor. Egyptian records reveal that entire families could be enslaved for generations, their fates sealed by the mistakes of their ancestors. Unlike free workers, these enslaved laborers had no choice. They worked or they died. But not all of them accepted their fate. One group of captives attempted something unheard of, a daring escape from the clutches of Egypt's most powerful rulers. Who were they? And did they succeed? The answer lies in one of the oldest recorded slave revolts in history. The first slave revolt in recorded history. Revolts are rare in ancient history, but they did happen. In the 18th century BCE, records from the Egyptian Middle Kingdom tell of a rebellion among enslaved workers. The details are sparse, but one thing is clear. Hundreds of captives from a foreign land conspired to flee their bondage. They stole weapons, they coordinated their escape, they planned their revolt under the cover of darkness. Egyptian forces crushed the rebellion before it could spread, executing the ringleaders as a warning to others. But the attempt revealed something deeper. Slavery could never fully break the human will. No matter how powerful the system, people resisted. But while Egypt's revolt was short-lived, another civilization would take slavery to a level never seen before. A civilization that built its empire on chains and perfected the art of enslavement. For centuries, Rome stood as the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Its legions conquered vast territories, stretching from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. But its power didn't come from its armies alone. Rome's true strength came from its ability to harness millions of enslaved people, turning them into the gears of an unstoppable war machine. 1 in 3 people in Rome were enslaved. They worked in the fields, in the mines, in the grand estates of the elite. They fought in the Colosseum, spilling blood for entertainment. Some Roman slaves were treated as highly educated tutors, doctors, and accountants, but most were brutalized, crushed under the weight of an empire that saw them as disposable. And yet Rome made one fatal mistake. They underestimated their own slaves, because deep in the heart of the empire, one man, one enslaved gladiator, would lead an uprising that nearly brought Rome to its knees. In 73 BCE, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus and 70 of his fellow enslaved warriors escaped from their training school and took refuge on Mount Vesuvius. Rome laughed at first. What could a handful of runaway slaves possibly do? But Spartacus didn't run. He fought. Over the next 2 years, he built an army of 100,000 enslaved people, men, women, and children who had nothing to lose. They defeated Roman legions, one after another, striking fear into the heart of the Republic. For the first time, Rome, a city built on slavery, faced the terrifying possibility that the enslaved could turn against their masters. But Rome would not fall so easily. The full force of the Republic crushed Spartacus' rebellion in 71 BCE. His followers were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road as a warning. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. And yet the legend of Spartacus endured. Even in death, he became a symbol, a reminder that slavery, no matter how powerful, was never truly unchallenged. But Rome was not the end of the story. Slavery would continue to evolve, from medieval serfdom to the transatlantic slave trade, shaping the world in ways we still feel today. This is just the beginning. The story of slavery is a story of power, resistance, and survival, a story that spans every civilization, every continent, and every era of human history. And the deeper we look, the more secrets we uncover. The rise of slave empires, how Greece and Rome perfected human bondage. Athens, the cradle of democracy, the birthplace of philosophy, art, and the ideals that would shape the Western world. But beneath the marble temples, in the shadows of the Parthenon, another reality existed, one that rarely appears in the grand retelling of Greek civilization. Athens, the city that celebrated freedom and individual rights, was built on the backs of tens of thousands of enslaved people. Most Athenians, even the great philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle, saw slavery as a fact of life. It wasn't just accepted, it was essential. Every citizen's wealth, every debate in the Agora, every theater performance at the Dionysia rested on the forced labor of those who had no voice. But there was something different about Greek slavery. Not all enslaved people were treated the same. Some, like those forced to work in the silver mines of Lorient, suffered unthinkable conditions, chained underground, breathing in toxic dust, dying by the thousands. Others were household servants, artisans, and even educators, valued not just for their labor, but for their skills and knowledge. The wealthiest Athenians rented out enslaved people to the government, making money from their suffering. Greek democracy flourished, but only for those who counted as citizens. And beneath it all, a question lingered. If Athens was the pinnacle of civilization, why was it built on such brutal inequality? But if the Greeks perfected the idea of slavery as a necessary evil, the Romans would turn it into something even more terrifying. A system so vast, so brutal, and so efficient that it would shape the course of history itself. By the time Rome reached its peak, 1 in every 3 people was enslaved. The Roman economy didn't just rely on slavery, it depended on it. Massive latifundia, enormous estates worked by enslaved laborers, kept Rome fed and its economy growing. Wealthy Romans collected people the way others collected art. Some households had hundreds of enslaved workers trained in everything from cooking to engineering. Even the entertainment industry was built on slavery. The Colosseum wasn't just a stage for gladiators. It was a slaughterhouse where enslaved men fought and died for the amusement of the elite. But the most terrifying part? Rome wasn't just enslaving its enemies. It was industrializing the process. Slave markets operated like financial hubs. Auctioneers advertised people like livestock, setting prices based on their age, health, and skills. The Roman Navy patrolled the Mediterranean, hunting for human cargo, capturing entire villages to feed the insatiable demand for new labor. Banks and merchants offered loans secured by enslaved people, creating an entire economy built on human suffering. Rome turned slavery into a global enterprise, making it more efficient, more organized, and more profitable than ever before. But the bigger a system grows, the more unstable it becomes. And deep within the heart of the empire, one man would rise up, threatening to bring Rome's entire slave economy crashing down. In 73 BCE, in a gladiator school in Capua, one enslaved warrior made a decision that would shake the empire to its core. His name was Spartacus, a Thracian warrior forced to fight for the amusement of the Roman elite. He was supposed to die in the arena, just another body in Rome's endless hunger for blood and spectacle. But Spartacus refused to play by the rules. Along with 70 other enslaved gladiators, he broke out of the school, killing the guards and seizing whatever weapons they could find. Instead of fleeing into the wilderness, he turned back toward Rome. His small band of escapees grew into an army, 100,000 strong. For 2 years, Spartacus and his followers defied the greatest empire on earth. They defeated multiple Roman legions, proving that an army of former enslaved people could stand against professional soldiers. They seized food, weapons, and even Roman cities, sending a message that slavery was not invincible. His name spread across the empire, whispered in the slave markets, in the villas, in the grand halls of the Senate. If Spartacus could break free, what if others followed? The rebellion terrified Rome. If Spartacus succeeded, the entire foundation of the empire, its economy, its workforce, its power, would collapse. So Rome did what it did best. It crushed him. The Roman general Crassus led an army of 40,000 to hunt Spartacus down. When the final battle came, Spartacus fought to the death, but Rome took no chances. To make an example of his rebellion, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road leading into Rome. Their bodies lined the path for miles, a brutal warning to anyone who dared to dream of freedom. The empire had won, but the fear never left. Rome had seen its own nightmare come to life. The enslaved could rise, they could fight, and they could nearly win. And if it happened once, could it happen again? Spartacus was gone, but slavery was not. And as Rome fell, new systems of human bondage emerged, each more sophisticated, more brutal, and more far-reaching than the last time. African kingdoms in the internal slave trade, the complex reality before European involvement. For centuries before the arrival of European ships, Africa was home to civilizations as grand and sophisticated as any in history. The Empire of Ghana, 300 to 1200 CE, rich with gold, controlled vast trade routes that stretched across the Sahara. Mali, 1235 to 1600 CE, the land of Mansa Musa, the richest man in history, boasted great cities like Timbuktu, where scholars studied philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. Songhai, 1430 to 1591 CE, one of the largest empires Africa had ever seen, ruled over a territory larger than Western Europe. These kingdoms were centers of commerce, culture, and political influence. But beneath their wealth and power lay a practice often overlooked. Slavery was already woven into their societies long before Europeans arrived. But this was not the same system that would later devastate the continent. The word slavery conjures images of chains, whips, and plantation fields. But in many African societies, slavery operated under very different rules. In Ghana, enslaved people were war captives, criminals, or debtors, but they were often integrated into society, sometimes gaining freedom and even rising to positions of power. In Mali, enslaved individuals were called jono, but their status was not necessarily permanent. Many could marry into free families, own land, and even rise to positions of influence in royal courts. Some enslaved individuals served in the military as artisans or as trusted advisors to rulers, a stark contrast to the hereditary chattel slavery of the Americas. Unlike European chattel slavery, where people were considered property for life and their children automatically enslaved, African slavery was often fluid, allowing for social mobility. But then, everything changed. The moment European traders set foot on African shores, a slow transformation began, one that would spiral into catastrophe. For centuries, Africa's internal slave systems had been self-contained, functioning within a society that did not yet see human beings as mere commodities. But in the 1400s, something new arrived on Africa's western coastline: Portuguese ships. At first, the relationship was about trade. Europeans came for gold, ivory, and spices, offering textiles, weapons, and horses in return. But they soon saw another commodity, one that was infinitely more profitable. At first, European traders bought enslaved individuals from African rulers, who viewed them as just another form of wealth exchange. But demand grew and grew. African kingdoms expanded wars, raided rival villages, and fueled an ever-growing network of human trafficking, not for their own use but for foreign profit. It was no longer about war captives or social hierarchy. It was about mass exportation. The once contained system was now spiraling out of control. But what made African leaders participate, and why did some resist? The answer is more complicated than history textbooks admit. The story of Africa's involvement in the slave trade isn't simple. Some rulers saw European traders as dangerous invaders. Others saw them as economic partners, an opportunity too lucrative to ignore. The Kingdom of Congo, 15th to 17th century, initially welcomed the Portuguese, even converting to Christianity, but soon became entangled in the growing trade of human lives. The Dahomey Empire, 1600s to 1800s, built its wealth by capturing and selling rival tribes to Europeans, profiting massively while fueling the destruction of entire African communities. Meanwhile, some resisted. Nzinga Mbande, Queen of Ndongo, and Matamba waged war against the Portuguese for decades, refusing to sell her people into bondage. Some kings, driven by power and profit, played directly into European hands, but they did not realize the scale of the storm they had unleashed. What had begun as an exchange between equals would soon turn into an all-consuming machine, one that no African king could control. And once European ships perfected the Middle Passage, the fate of millions was sealed. It began long before the European ships arrived on African shores, before the transatlantic horrors, before the plantations of the New World. Another vast slave trade was already in motion, one that would shape continents for over 1,000 years. The rise of Islam in the 7th century brought not just religious transformation, but also a massive expansion of trade networks. And at the center of these networks was human trafficking. The Arab Muslim Empire, stretching from Spain to India, needed labor to fuel its vast economy. And there was one region that provided an endless supply: Africa. By the 8th century, Arab traders had established a thriving slave market along the eastern coast of Africa, stretching from modern-day Tanzania to Sudan. Caravans of enslaved people marched thousands of miles across the Sahara, their bones littering the desert. The demand was insatiable. not just for labor, but for soldiers, concubines, and eunuchs who would serve in the courts of sultans and caliphs. But who were these people, and what happened to them once they entered the world of the Islamic slave trade? The truth is darker than many realize. The Islamic slave trade was not one trade route, it was a web, a massive interwoven system that stretched from the interior of Africa to the palaces of the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal courts of India. Unlike the European model, which focused on agriculture, the Islamic trade specialized in domestic servitude, military slavery, and concubinage. Many enslaved men were castrated, turning them into eunuchs, ensuring they could never father children or form family ties. Women were often sold into harems where they became concubines for powerful rulers. The Zanj Rebellion, 869 to 883 CE, a nearly forgotten chapter in history, saw 500,000 enslaved Africans rise up against the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the largest revolts in history, and yet their stories remain largely erased from mainstream history. Why? Because unlike the transatlantic trade, which left generations of descendants, many enslaved people under the Arab trade were never allowed to have families. But how did this trade operate for over 1,000 years? And why do so few speak of it today? The answers lie in the hidden economies of the Islamic world. The Arab slave trade was not confined to Africa. It expanded across three major routes. The trans-Saharan route. Enslaved people were forced to march across the desert, often dying before reaching North African markets. The Indian Ocean route. Ships transported enslaved Africans to Persia, India, and even China. The Middle Eastern route. From Baghdad to Istanbul, African slaves became palace guards, domestic workers, and sex slaves. Unlike in the Americas, where enslaved populations grew over generations, the Arab trade was designed to be a constant cycle. People were taken, used, and replaced. And yet, one of the most shocking truths of all is this. While European colonialism ended transatlantic slavery, the Islamic slave trade persisted well into the 20th century. Slavery in the Islamic world did not vanish with the abolition movements of the 19th century. In Saudi Arabia and Yemen, slavery was only officially abolished in 1962, but reports indicate it still exists in underground networks. In Mauritania, slavery was officially outlawed in 1981, but human trafficking persists. Even today, forced labor and servitude in parts of the Middle East bear striking similarities to the old trade. The transatlantic slave trade remains the most well-known chapter of human bondage. But the Islamic slave trade lasted longer, affected more regions, and remains shrouded in silence. And if we forget it, does that mean history is doomed to repeat itself? The story of the transatlantic slave trade did not begin in the Americas. It began in Lisbon, Seville, and the sugar plantations of the Atlantic Islands, where European powers experimented with forced labor systems long before Columbus set sail. The first known ship of enslaved Africans arrived in Portugal in 1444, landing at Lagos under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator. Chroniclers described a haunting scene. Dozens of captives, some weeping, others too stunned to react, separated from their families in an alien land. This moment marked the transition of African servitude from regional trade to a European-dominated system of human commodification. But Portugal did not merely import enslaved Africans. It exported the system. On the Canary Islands, Madeira, and São Tomé, Portuguese settlers established vast sugar plantations, pioneering a plantation economy reliant on forced African labor. The blueprint for the Caribbean was being drawn up, not in the New World, but on European-controlled Atlantic islands. And then came an unexpected player, one whose ambitions would turn a European trade network into a global human trafficking operation. Christopher Columbus' arrival in 1492 is often framed as the moment the Americas entered world history. But for the indigenous people he encountered, it was the beginning of a catastrophe. Within months of landing in Hispaniola, Columbus and his men had enslaved thousands of Taino people, forcing them to mine for gold under brutal conditions. He shipped over 500 indigenous captives to Spain in 1495, launching the first recorded transatlantic shipment of enslaved people. However, the most overlooked aspect of Columbus's impact on slavery is this. He was the first to suggest replacing dying indigenous laborers with Africans. In a letter to the Spanish crown in 1503, Columbus proposed importing enslaved Africans to supplement the dwindling native workforce. Though he did not live to see the full execution of this idea, his suggestion would soon become the foundation of Spain's colonial labor system. But Columbus was just the beginning. Spain was about to institutionalize African slavery in ways even he hadn't foreseen. In the early 1500s, Spain implemented the encomienda system, a legal framework granting Spanish colonists the right to indigenous labor in exchange for protection and religious conversion. In practice, this system was slavery in all but name. Encomenderos forced indigenous people to mine gold, build infrastructure, and cultivate crops under horrific conditions. Within 2 generations, the indigenous population of Hispaniola had been reduced by 90%. The Spanish crown, disturbed by reports of abuse, issued the new laws of 1542, which attempted to limit encomendero power. But these reforms were largely ignored or overturned by Spanish elites. Meanwhile, another labor source was emerging, one that would permanently alter the demographic landscape of the Americas. And the justification for this shift was built on an economic and religious foundation that still echoes today. The death of indigenous people from disease and forced labor posed a crisis for Spanish colonists. Their mines and plantations needed a sustainable labor force. By the early 1500s, Spain had authorized the direct shipment of enslaved Africans to the Caribbean. But something had changed. Unlike earlier systems, where enslavement was temporary or tied to war, this was becoming a permanent, racialized status. The Asiento system, established in 1518, granted Portuguese traders a monopoly on selling African slaves to Spanish colonies. Enslaved Africans were now seen not only as laborers, but as chattel property, lifelong slaves whose children would inherit their status. This shift laid the foundation for the racial caste system that would dominate the Atlantic world for centuries. And while Spain and Portugal dominated the early trade, another European power was watching closely, one that would turn human trafficking into an empire-defining industry. The Triangle Trade, 1600s to 1800s, the story of the Triangle Trade is often told as a simple loop. European merchants sail to Africa, trade goods for enslaved people, transport them across the Atlantic, and return home with sugar, cotton, and tobacco. But the truth is far more chaotic, vast, and deeply entrenched in global economics. Before Europeans arrived in Africa, slavery already existed, but in vastly different forms. Enslaved individuals in many African societies could rise to positions of power, marry into families, and even regain their freedom. What the Europeans introduced was an irreversible, industrial-scale commodification of human lives. By the 1600s, European powers, Britain, France, Portugal, the Dutch, had established dozens of slave forts along the West African coast. These weren't just places of trade. They were prisons where captured men, women, and children waited weeks, months, sometimes years in dungeons, their fates decided by traders thousands of miles away. But the most shocking part? Some African leaders were complicit, selling captives from rival tribes, fueling a system that would eventually consume their own people. The Middle Passage remains one of the most gruesome and harrowing journeys in human history. Ships were packed so tightly that captives could not move for weeks at a time. Many died from disease, dehydration, or suicide. What's often left out of history books is the rebellions aboard these ships. The Little George Revolt, 1730, saw enslaved people break free, kill the crew, and attempt to sail back to Africa. The Amistad Mutiny, 1839, where Mende captives took control of the ship and fought a legal battle for their freedom in the U.S. Supreme Court. Slave ship captains often insured their cargo, but the policies did not cover death from disease, only drowning. This led to one of the most horrifying financial schemes in history. Captains threw sick enslaved people overboard so they could claim insurance money. The infamous case of the Zong Massacre, 1781, 132 enslaved Africans were deliberately drowned so the crew could file an insurance claim. But while bodies were sinking beneath the waves, European banks were rising to unimaginable wealth. The true financial machinery of slavery was only just beginning. The slave trade wasn't just a moral atrocity, it was a financial empire. It bankrolled entire industries, built global economic superpowers, and left a legacy that still shapes modern finance. Banks and insurance. Major banks like Barclays and Lloyd's of London directly financed slave voyages and insured plantations against slave rebellions. Industrial Revolution fuel. British textile mills thrived on slave-grown cotton. Caribbean sugar plantations were among the most profitable enterprises in the world. The Wall Street connection. Before it became the heart of global finance, Wall Street was a slave market. Enslaved people were collateral for loans, and many of the earliest fortunes in American banking came from slave-backed investments. But what happened when the tide turned? How did the same powers that profited from slavery suddenly claim to be its greatest opponents? While traders and bankers counted their profits, enslaved people never stopped resisting. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. A successful slave revolt, against all odds, led to the first free black republic in the Americas. Maroon communities. In Jamaica, Brazil, and the U.S., escaped enslaved people built entire hidden societies, defying colonial rule. Economic shifts forced. Abolition. By the 1800s, industrial capitalism was making slavery less profitable for Britain. Abolitionists fought moral battles, but economic realities played just as big a role in ending the trade. But if slavery ended, why do its financial legacies still haunt us today? The impact of the triangle trade never truly ended. Its echoes still shape modern economies, racial wealth gaps, and global trade systems. The $14 trillion theft. Scholars estimate that the unpaid labor of enslaved people would amount to over $14 trillion in today's money. Legacy and institutions. Many of today's biggest banks, universities, and corporations owe their early fortunes to slavery. The wealth gap between black and white Americans can be traced directly to who got to inherit wealth and who did not. Queen Nzinga, born into war, she sees her father resist the Portuguese and vows never to submit. In a critical diplomatic meeting, she refuses to kneel before Portuguese officials. Instead, she sits on a human chair, making one thing clear: Angola bows to no one. When diplomacy fails, she turns to war, allying with the Dutch and launching a 30-year resistance movement. Nzinga adopted European mercenary tactics, creating one of Africa's first modern armies, integrating former slaves and even defected Portuguese soldiers. Nzinga's war is relentless, but what happens when her European allies abandon her? And what lessons will future rebels learn from her fight? The enslaved Africans in the Carolinas were not just laborers. They were former warriors from the Kingdom of Congo, trained in battle before they were captured. Jemmy, the leader, was likely a military veteran, fluent in multiple languages. The March of the Rebels. The rebels seize a weapons depot, arming themselves with muskets and machetes. They move with precision, suggesting pre-planned strategy, not a random riot. As they march, they chant in Kikongo, rallying more than 80 followers. The rebels had a tactical goal, not just freedom, but reaching Spanish Florida, where the Spanish crown had promised liberty to escaped slaves. Historians now believe Spain encouraged slave rebellions to destabilize British colonies. But before Jemmy can reach Florida, colonial militias trap them. The price of failure will be horrific. Jamaica's cockpit country, 1700s, runaway slaves carve out secret mountain strongholds. The Maroon warriors were masters of guerrilla warfare, hiding in dense forests, striking in swift attacks, then vanishing. The British, despite superior firepower, could never fully defeat them. The Maroons developed complex whistle codes, using different bird calls to signal ambushes. These codes are still used by some Jamaican communities today. Maroons weren't the only ones creating hidden worlds. In Brazil, an entire kingdom of freed slaves rises, and it will take the full power of the Portuguese Empire to bring it down. Haiti, 1791, the fire that burned an empire. The final chapter of resistance is not just a revolt. It is the only successful slave revolution in history. In the shadowy halls of Virginia's government, a quiet revolution takes place. One by one, laws are passed. 1662. If your mother is enslaved, you are enslaved for life. 1667. Baptism no longer grants freedom. 1705. The Virginia slave codes strip black people of all legal rights. These laws didn't emerge in a vacuum. They were modeled after the Barbadian slave codes, a brutal legal system that had already perfected racialized slavery in the Caribbean. But why now? Because of a terrifying event in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. Poor whites and blacks united against the elite, forcing colonial leaders to drive a wedge between them. Slavery is no longer just about work, it's about social control. But the enslaved will not stay silent. The economic machine. How slavery built Wall Street. By the 18th century, slavery isn't just a Southern institution, it's the engine of American capitalism. Banks issue mortgages on enslaved people. Insurance companies write policies to protect slave investments. Northern ship owners transport millions across the Atlantic. Enslaved people were not just laborers, they were financial instruments. The same banks that still exist today, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, once made profits securing human lives as assets. But money isn't the only force in motion. Resistance is coming, and it will shake the foundations of the American economy itself. The birth of racial slavery, how Virginia's laws of 1662 locked generations into chains. It wasn't a sudden proclamation. It wasn't a single event. It was a quiet shift, one law at a time, one courtroom ruling at a time, until an entire race was locked in bondage, not just for life, but for generations to come. In the early 1600s, Virginia's labor system was chaotic. African laborers, European indentured servants, and native captives worked side by side. Some Africans even gained freedom and owned land. But by the mid-17th century, something changed. The ruling class made a chilling decision. A new law was passed in Virginia's assembly. It stated that a child's status would follow that of the mother. meaning that if a mother was enslaved, her children would be enslaved too. This went against English legal tradition, which followed the father's status. But this wasn't about law, it was about control. Why this law? Because African women were having children, and their status was unclear. White landowners saw an opportunity. If blackness itself became a marker of enslavement, they could ensure a permanent labor force. But this was only the beginning. Within decades, these laws wouldn't just define slavery, they would define race itself. By the 18th century, slavery was no longer just about labor, it was about global domination. Three crops, tobacco, sugar, and cotton, became the fuel of an empire, and enslaved people were the machinery that kept it running. Before cotton, before sugar, tobacco was king in Virginia. Enslaved people worked 14-plus-hour days in the fields, breaking their backs to grow a crop that turned planters into millionaires. Little-known fact, Thomas Jefferson personally profited from enslaved labor on his massive tobacco farms, but he was also drowning in debt. Virginia's economy was so tied to human bondage that even its most famous founding fathers couldn't escape the system they helped create. But what if a single crop could make even more money? A crop that would turn human bodies into numbers on a ledger. The blood price of sugar, 1700s to 1800s. In the Caribbean and Louisiana, sugar was called white gold, but its true cost was measured in human lives. On brutal sugar plantations, the average life expectancy of an enslaved person was just 7 to 10 years. They weren't expected to survive. Little-known fact, enslaved people on sugar plantations rarely lived long enough to have children. So planters constantly bought new captives from Africa, fueling the transatlantic slave trade. But if sugar was wealth, cotton was empire, and it would shape America's future in ways no one could predict. The crop that built America, 1800s. Cotton wasn't just a crop, it was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. By the early 1800s, America was producing 75% of the world's cotton. The hidden economy. Cotton wasn't just in the South. Northern banks financed plantations, northern factories spun the cotton into fabric, and Wall Street investors profited from slavery-backed loans. By the time America was on the brink of civil war, one thing was clear. Slavery wasn't dying. It was more profitable than ever. Slavery wasn't just labor, it was a financial system. Slavery was never just about picking crops. It was a global economy, a system where enslaved people weren't just laborers, but collateral, investments, and financial assets traded like stocks. In the early 1800s, enslaved people were worth more than all the railroads and factories in the U.S. combined. Enslaved people were used as collateral for loans. Banks in New York and London made fortunes by treating human lives as financial securities. Even after slavery was abolished, its financial structures remained. Many of the institutions built on slavery's wealth still exist today. The real story of slavery isn't just about the past. It's about power, wealth, and who still benefits from its legacy today. By the early 19th century, enslaved people were the single most valuable asset in the U.S., worth more than all the nation's railroads and factories combined. Banks weren't just passive institutions in this system, they were its architects. The hidden financial mechanism, slave-backed mortgages. Plantation owners took out massive loans using enslaved people as collateral. If they defaulted, banks seized human beings as property. And when banks saw the profitability of slavery, they didn't just lend money, they invested in the trade itself. Long before Wall Street became the center of global finance, it was a literal slave market. The shocking truth, major U.S. banks, including J.P. Morgan Chase and Citibank, have direct historical ties to financing slavery. Investors purchased shares in slave ships, speculated on the future price of enslaved labor, and funded the expansion of plantations across the South. But what if something happened to a human asset? That's where insurance companies stepped in. Companies like Lloyd's of London wrote policies not for enslaved people's protection, but for their owners. If an enslaved person died during transport, was lost at sea, or even executed by their owner, the insurance paid out. In 1781, the British ship Zong threw over 130 enslaved Africans overboard, then filed an insurance claim for damaged cargo. The case went to court, but not for murder. The debate was whether the insurance had to pay for the lost human property. And yet, even after the abolition of slavery, these institutions never lost their wealth, only their methods. The wealth generated from slavery didn't disappear. It was reinvested into railroads, industrial expansion, and modern banking. Universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton benefited from endowments tied to slave labor. Even today, major banks that once financed slavery remain financial giants, their origins largely erased from public memory. The chains may be gone, but the wealth remains. And so does the question, what do we do with this history? The Somerset case, 1772, was a turning point in Britain. A judge ruled that enslaved people could not be forcibly removed from Britain, leading many to believe slavery was illegal on English soil. This ruling did not free enslaved people in British colonies, but it sparked debate and forced the question, could slavery be morally and legally justified anymore? The ruling reached the Caribbean, but enslaved people there weren't waiting for a court decision. They were already fighting back. Across the Americas, enslaved people didn't just escape. They built entire free societies. In Jamaica, Queen Nanny of the Maroons led guerrilla warfare against the British, raiding plantations and freeing slaves. In Brazil, Quilombo dos Palmares, a massive runaway slave community, survived for nearly a century before being crushed. These revolts terrified slave owners. But what happened when they spread to the colony's economic heart? Haiti? Runaway slaves carve out secret mountain strongholds. The Maroon warriors were masters of guerrilla warfare, hiding in dense forests, striking in swift attacks, then vanishing. The British, despite superior firepower, could never fully defeat them. The Maroons developed complex whistle codes, using different bird calls to signal ambushes. These codes are still used by some Jamaican communities today. Maroons weren't the only ones creating hidden worlds. In Brazil, an entire kingdom of freed slaves rises, and it will take the full power of the Portuguese Empire to bring it down. Haiti, 1791, the fire that burned an empire. The final chapter of resistance is not just a revolt. It is the only successful slave revolution in history. By the 19th century, slavery was becoming less profitable due to industrialization. Key economic shifts that led to abolition. Machines replaced human labor, making wage labor more practical than slave labor. The cost of policing revolts and maintaining slavery was increasing. The British Navy, which had once protected slave ships, now hunted them down after 1807. But even after slavery was abolished, former slave owners found a way to maintain power. By rewriting the economic rules, slavery officially ended, but former slave owners were compensated while the freed people received nothing. In the U.S., the Civil War ended slavery, but within decades, sharecropping, convict leasing, and Jim Crow laws created a new racial caste system. Unspoken truth. Many modern corporations, banks, railroads, and textile industries owe their early fortunes to slavery. The abolition of slavery was a victory, but the economic systems it built still shape the world today. Before the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Civil War was not officially about ending slavery. Lincoln, though personally opposed to slavery, made it clear, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union." The North's primary goal was preserving the United States, not necessarily freeing the enslaved. In fact, Lincoln initially proposed gradual emancipation with compensation for slave owners, hoping to avoid war entirely. Even after war broke out, border states like Kentucky and Maryland still had slavery, and Lincoln needed them to stay in the Union. But while politicians debated, enslaved people weren't waiting for freedom, they were seizing it themselves. Long before the Emancipation Proclamation, enslaved people were escaping in droves to Union lines. This presented Union generals with an unexpected dilemma. What do we do with them? General Benjamin Butler, stationed in Virginia, made a bold move. He declared escaped slaves as contraband of war, meaning the Union would not return them to their owners. This small legal maneuver opened the floodgates. Enslaved people now rushed to Union camps, knowing they had a chance at freedom. By 1862, over 100,000 enslaved people had freed themselves, forcing Lincoln's hand. If enslaved people were already freeing themselves, could Lincoln afford to wait, or was it time to act? The Emancipation Proclamation was not a sudden moral revelation. It was a strategic war move. Lincoln had already written the order, but he was waiting for the right moment. His advisors warned, if he issued it after Union defeats, it would seem weak. Then came the Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day in American history. Though not a decisive victory, the Union pushed back Lee's invasion of the North. On September 22, 1862, he issued a preliminary warning. If the Confederacy did not surrender by January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in rebel-held territories would be declared free. The South ignored the warning. And so the new year arrived, and with it, history changed forever. At first glance, the Emancipation Proclamation declared the end of slavery, but there was a catch. It only freed enslaved people in Confederate states, not in the border states like Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware, which still allowed slavery. It depended on Union victory, which meant freedom was still uncertain. Yet it transformed the war's purpose. The Union was now fighting explicitly to end slavery, not just to preserve itself. But even with this bold proclamation, slavery did not die overnight. In fact, the South had its own plans to expand it, far beyond America's borders. Few people realized that the Confederacy did not just fight to preserve slavery in the U.S. They wanted to expand it globally. Southern leaders secretly negotiated with Spain to buy Cuba and turn it into a slave state. Thousands of Confederates fled to Brazil after the war, where slavery was still legal. They built a town called Americana, where their descendants still live today. But by 1865, their dreams of expansion were shattered because the war was about to end in a way no one expected. Despite Lincoln's proclamation, slavery still existed in Kentucky and Delaware after the war. Only with the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, was slavery officially abolished nationwide. The Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end the struggle for freedom. The battle over black rights had only just begun. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but with a dangerous exception. Forced labor was still legal as punishment for a crime. This loophole did not immediately create mass incarceration. Instead, Southern lawmakers first tried black codes, laws that kept black laborers tied to white landowners. When black codes were struck down, convict leasing emerged as Plan B. No Negro shall be allowed to rent or keep a house. Mississippi Black Codes, 1865. When direct legal slavery failed, the South turned to something even more insidious: slavery disguised as justice. By 1898, nearly 75% of Alabama's state revenue came from convict leasing. Northern industries, including U.S. Steel, relied on these prisoners. Banks in New York and London financed the expansion of convict labor industries. Prisoners were worked to death at higher rates than enslaved people before the Civil War. A report from a Georgia coal mine in 1887 documented prisoners being burned alive as punishment. But this was just one part of the new racial order. While some were imprisoned, others were economically enslaved. By 1910, Black Americans owned only 2% of the farmland in the South. Despite making up the majority of the agricultural workforce, white landowners controlled credit, tools, and markets. Debt became the new form of bondage, ensuring Black families remained tied to plantations. Even those who avoided prisons and debt peonage found another force waiting to control them: Jim Crow. Slavery never ended. It was repackaged. The systems of racial oppression after 1865 were not accidental or improvised. They were deliberately designed to maintain white economic dominance. And today, the 13th Amendment's loophole remains. Private prisons still exploit prisoners for labor. The legacy of sharecropping remains in modern wealth disparities, and Wall Street, built on slave wealth, still dominates the global economy. The legacy and consequences of slavery. Emancipation was not the beginning of economic liberation for Black Americans. It was the start of a new form of containment. When the Civil War ended, formerly enslaved people owned 0.5% of the nation's total wealth, despite making up nearly 4 million of its laborers. Yet their labor had already enriched white families, businesses, and institutions for centuries. The response? Black codes were passed almost immediately. These laws criminalized poverty, forcing freedmen into labor contracts that mimicked slavery. Convict leasing turned state prisons into for-profit slavery. Those who sought true independence, such as Black farmers in Mississippi and Alabama, found themselves locked out of land ownership through legal loopholes and white terror. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, a direct attempt to redistribute the wealth built on Black backs, was reversed by Andrew Johnson within a year. Instead, the very land that should have provided Black generational wealth was returned to Confederate owners. One of the first lessons in post-slavery America was this: economic power was more threatening than political rights. The racial wealth gap was not an accident. It was a design system, reinforced at every turn. When Black people in the early 20th century tried to create their own wealth, white supremacist violence struck. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. A thriving Black economic hub was obliterated in a matter of hours. Hundreds killed, businesses and homes razed, insurance claims denied. The state did not intervene to protect its Black citizens, but allowed the destruction to happen. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898 a coup d'etat, overthrew a biracial government, erasing Black political and economic leadership for decades. Rosewood, Florida, 1923 a prosperous Black town was massacred, its land stolen and absorbed into white ownership. Beyond outright violence, banks and financial institutions ensured Black economic stagnation. The FHA, Federal Housing Administration, in redlining 1930s to 1960s. The government itself created the maps that labeled Black neighborhoods as high risk, preventing mortgages and home loans. Meanwhile, white Americans built wealth through suburban expansion, predatory lending, 2008 housing crisis. Decades later, these same discriminatory financial structures resurfaced. Black families were disproportionately given subprime mortgages even when they qualified for better rates, leading to catastrophic wealth loss during the Great Recession. At every step, Black economic success was sabotaged through policy, through violence, through exclusion. While the U.S. has resisted discussions of reparations, other nations have acknowledged the economic destruction caused by state-sanctioned injustices. Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors and their descendants. The UK compensated slave-owning families, not the enslaved, when it abolished slavery. Haiti was forced to pay reparations to France for winning its own freedom, an economic shackle that lasted well into the 20th century. Yet in America, the wealth stolen through slavery and its aftermath has never been accounted for. If the wages stolen from enslaved people were paid today, they would amount to over $14 trillion. But this is more than numbers. It represents schools never built, businesses never opened, homes never passed down. By 2023, the median wealth of a white family was nearly 8 times that of a Black family. The wealth gap is not simply a remnant of the past, it is an ongoing reality. By the early 1800s, enslaved people were the single most valuable asset in America, worth more than all the country's railroads, factories, and banks combined. Cotton was king, and human beings were its currency. The key to generational wealth is ownership of land, businesses, and capital. But in the South, it was human ownership that built dynasties. White plantation families passed down vast wealth, land, and status. Meanwhile, the people who produced that wealth, enslaved Africans, were bought, sold, and worked to death, leaving no inheritance for their descendants. But the financial exploitation didn't end in the fields. Banks, insurance companies, and northern industrialists all profited from the enslaved labor system. Wall Street firms like J.P. Morgan Chase and Wachovia accepted enslaved people as loan collateral. Insurance companies like New York Life sold policies compensating slave owners, not the enslaved, when their property died. The federal government itself backed slavery financially, using enslaved-produced goods to fuel national growth. This was not just an economic system, it was a deliberate wealth extraction machine. But what happened when slavery was abolished? Would these families finally get a chance to build wealth? The answer is far more disturbing. In 1865, the U.S. government promised newly freed Black Americans 40 acres and a mule, a plan that would have redistributed land to those who had worked it for generations. For the first time, Black families would have owned the soil beneath their feet. But within a year, President Andrew Johnson reversed the order. Land that had been seized from Confederate owners was returned to them. Formerly enslaved people were left with nothing. Meanwhile, white plantation families kept their land and wealth, setting the stage for generational inheritance. Denied land, Black families were forced into sharecropping, a system designed to keep them in permanent debt. Landowners charge exorbitant fees for housing and tools. Harvests were manipulated, so Black farmers always owed more than they earned. By 1900, 80% of Black farmers were trapped in this cycle, unable to accumulate any wealth. But what about those who managed to escape the cycle? Surely some found success. What happened to them? Despite every obstacle, Black communities built thriving economic centers. Towns like Tulsa's Black Wall Street, Wilmington, and Rosewood became symbols of Black prosperity. But these successes were seen as a threat. Time and again, Black wealth was violently destroyed. Wilmington Massacre, 1898. A coup overthrew a Black-led government, massacring hundreds and stripping Black landowners of property. Tulsa Massacre, 1921. A white mob obliterated 35 city blocks, killing residents and erasing $200 million in Black wealth, adjusted for inflation. Rosewood Massacre, 1923. A prosperous Black town was burned to the ground. Survivors fled, leaving their property behind, land that was stolen and sold off to white buyers. Each time black communities built wealth, they were met with economic violence. But as the 20th century progressed, a new form of theft emerged, not through fire and bullets, but through laws and policies. The destruction of black wealth did not stop with massacres. The most insidious methods were yet to come. While the New Deal helped millions of white Americans secure homes and wealth, black Americans were systematically excluded. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, created maps that marked black neighborhoods as high risk, denying them home loans. Banks refused to lend to black families, even when they had stable incomes. The GI Bill 1944, which helped white veterans buy homes and attend college, was largely inaccessible to black veterans, keeping them out of the greatest wealth-building programs in U.S. history. By 1960, 98% of FHA-backed home loans had gone to white families, allowing them to accumulate generational wealth while black families were left behind. White families who bought homes in the 1940s to 60s saw their property values skyrocket. They passed those homes down to their children, creating generational wealth. Meanwhile, black families were trapped in red-line neighborhoods, denied mortgages, and forced into renting, unable to build equity. By the time the civil rights movement fought for fair housing laws, the damage had already been done. But surely by the 21st century, things had changed, or had they? Even after civil rights victories, black families continued to face financial discrimination. The war on drugs, 80s to 90s, led to mass incarceration, disproportionately targeting black men and stripping families of income and home ownership opportunities. Predatory lending. 1990s to 2008 saw banks deliberately pushing risky subprime mortgages onto black homeowners, leading to massive foreclosures during the Great Recession. Black students take on twice as much student debt as white students, delaying home ownership and wealth-building opportunities. Today, the median white household has nearly 8 times the wealth of the median black household. This gap is not a mystery. It is the direct result of centuries of exclusion, theft, and exploitation. The wealth stolen through slavery and systemic racism has never been repaid. Unlike Germany's reparations to Holocaust survivors or South Africa's reconciliation efforts, America has never formally accounted for this generational theft. As the camera zooms out on a map of America, overlaying wealth distribution with redlining maps, convict leasing locations, and destroyed black towns, the reality becomes clear. This is not just history. This is now. The question remains, what would it take to finally close the wealth gap? Modern slavery isn't confined to history books. It lives in plain sight. Today, over 50 million people are forced to labor, traded as commodities in a global network that thrives on secrecy and corruption. Global forced labor now generates an estimated $150 billion a year. This isn't limited to a single region. In the fishing fleets of Southeast Asia, workers are crammed into vessels, enduring years at sea with little food and brutal working conditions. West African cocoa farms employ child labor on an industrial scale, ensuring the world's chocolate remains inexpensive. In the factories of Bangladesh and India, millions produce fast fashion, while in the electronics hubs of China, workers build devices that power modern life. Reports from the International Labor Organization and investigative journalism have revealed that many multinational companies, despite public commitments to ethical sourcing, are still linked to these exploitative practices. How does such a massive hidden economy operate in complete darkness? The answer lies in the very structure of global commerce. In contrast, an equally disturbing world exists beneath neon signs and online ads. The global sex trafficking industry is estimated to generate around $99 billion annually. Victims, mostly women and children, are lured with false promises of opportunity or love. Once ensnared, they are forced into prostitution in brothels, massage parlors, and clandestine online networks. Transnational criminal networks, operating with military precision, use fake passports, encrypted communications, and sophisticated financial schemes to move victims across borders. Investigative reports, such as those by Amnesty International and UNODC, have documented how traffickers use coercion, violence, and even digital manipulation to maintain control. Who stands to gain from this hidden economy, and why are these networks rarely dismantled by law enforcement? Organized crime syndicates run trafficking rings with impunity, often with the tacit approval of corrupt officials in both developing and developed nations. Many governments have been slow to enforce anti-trafficking laws, while in some regions, officials are bribed to look the other way. Corporate supply chains are tainted by forced labor. Major retailers have been exposed for sourcing raw materials and products from regions where exploitation is rampant, all to drive down costs and boost profits. Court documents from landmark cases, such as lawsuits against multinational companies for knowingly profiting from forced labor, highlight the entanglement of global finance with human exploitation. But when victims try to escape, they find themselves trapped by invisible chains, debt, fear, and legal barriers that make freedom nearly impossible. Across the globe, activists, journalists, and survivors are beginning to expose these hidden networks. Undercover investigations have brought trafficking rings to light, prompting some governments to enact tougher anti-trafficking measures. Innovative technologies, from blockchain to forensic accounting, are being used to track forced labor in global supply chains. Survivor-led organizations are pushing for systemic change, demanding that companies and governments be held accountable for their roles in perpetuating exploitation. The challenge now is not only to rescue those in bondage, but to reform the economic systems that make modern slavery profitable. The question remains, will the world finally take decisive action to end this hidden crisis? Slavery ended in 1865. The lesson moves on. But history isn't a neat, completed chapter. It's a shadow stretching into the present, woven into the financial institutions, corporate monopolies, and social hierarchies we navigate. Slavery is not just a crime of the past. It is an economic structure that shaped the modern world. Its ghost lingers in wealth disparities, in the policies that followed, and in the unresolved legacies of exploitation. Slavery wasn't just labor. It was an economic institution that built the world's first modern financial system. Enslaved people were collateral in massive banking schemes. Wall Street's earliest fortunes were made trading enslaved people as investments. Cotton, sugar, and tobacco, industries powered by slavery, created generational wealth still visible today. In 1860, enslaved people were worth more than all U.S. railroads, factories, and banks combined, an estimated $3.5 billion, $115 billion today. Insurance companies like Aetna and New York Life insured slave owners against the loss of enslaved workers. The Bank of England held investments in Caribbean plantations long after Britain's abolition of slavery. But when the chains were legally broken, did the wealth they created disappear, or did it simply change hands? The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but it contained a fatal loophole. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States. Thousands of newly freed black men were arrested under vague vagrancy laws and forced to work in coal mines and railroads for private profit. Government-backed housing policies ensured black communities remained segregated and economically isolated. $3 million in black savings vanished overnight, with no government bailout. If slavery ended, why did its financial beneficiaries continue to grow richer while its victims remained locked out of opportunity? Black Americans were not just victims of oppression, they built prosperity despite it. By 1921, Tulsa's Black Wall Street housed 600 businesses, including black-owned banks, hotels, and newspapers. But on June 1, 1921, a white mob, aided by local police and planes dropping incendiary bombs, destroyed it in a single night. The Tulsa Race Massacre resulted in $27 million, $400 million today, in lost black wealth. Insurance companies refused to compensate victims, erasing generational wealth. The U.S. government didn't acknowledge the massacre until nearly a century later. If slavery ended in 1865, why was black economic success still under attack in 1921? Slavery isn't just history, it continues in different forms. Private prisons, U.S. prisoners, mostly black and Latino, produce goods for major corporations at wages as low as 12 cents per hour. Forced labor in supply chains. The modern fashion and electronics industries rely on labor conditions that mirror slavery, from cocoa farms in Ghana to sweatshops in Bangladesh. Human trafficking. More than 50 million people globally are enslaved in forced labor or sex trafficking. The U.S. 13th Amendment legalized forced labor for those convicted of crimes, creating a direct pipeline from slavery to mass incarceration. China, the U.S., and the UAE all house modern-day forced labor camps. If the world condemns slavery, why does its economic logic persist today? History is not just about the past, it's about power. Who holds it, who built it, and who remains locked out? The consequences of slavery are not distant echoes. They are today's reality. Understanding slavery is not about guilt. It is about recognition of a stolen past, a manipulated present, and a future that demands justice. Now that we know the truth, will we continue to look away? If history is written by the victors, what happens to the voices of the oppressed? More importantly, what happens when an entire chapter of history is rewritten or erased? Slavery wasn't just a footnote in history, it was the backbone of the global economy for centuries. Yet today's textbooks often soften its brutality, minimize its economic impact, and downplay its lingering consequences. This is not accidental. It is a deliberate reshaping of history, one that has been happening for over a century. The textbook wars, who decides what's taught? Textbooks are not neutral. They are curated, edited, and in some cases, censored to align with political and ideological agendas. In the early 1900s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, UDC, waged a campaign to rewrite history. They pushed for textbooks that painted slavery as a civilizing institution rather than a system of human exploitation. By the 1950s, Southern states rejected textbooks that included details about racial violence, Reconstruction, or Black resistance. Today, modern curriculum debates still reflect this legacy. Some states have removed references to slavery's role in America's wealth and power, replacing them with vague terms like involuntary relocation. But how deep does this rewriting go? And who profits from keeping the truth buried? Textbooks and curriculums have systematically watered down the realities of slavery in several ways. 1. Language manipulation. A. Workers instead of enslaved people, implying choice. B. The South depended on labor instead of the South depended on human trafficking. C. Slaves were brought to America rather than millions were kidnapped, shackled, and sold in violent transactions. 2. Omission of economic impact. Many textbooks fail to mention that enslaved people were the most valuable financial asset in America by 1860, worth more than all U.S. railroads, banks, and factories combined. The banking and insurance industries that profited from slavery are rarely discussed. Companies like Aetna and J.P. Morgan Chase have historical records of insuring slave owners against the deaths of enslaved laborers. 3. Minimizing violence. In some textbooks, the Middle Passage, where millions of Africans were packed into ships, many dying of disease and starvation, is described as a difficult journey rather than an atrocity. The horrors of plantation life, whippings, forced breeding, and the sale of children are often omitted. By shaping how we teach history, society controls how we understand the present. But what are the consequences of an entire generation growing up misinformed? Racial wealth gap. If students are not taught how slavery built generational wealth for white families while preventing black wealth accumulation, they will struggle to understand today's economic inequalities. Mass incarceration. Without recognizing how black codes and convict leasing replaced slavery with prison labor, people won't connect the dots between the past and modern systemic racism. Voter suppression. If Reconstruction's successes and failures are erased, students won't recognize today's voter suppression laws as echoes of the past. If we erase the history of oppression, how can we recognize when it repeats itself? Today, historians, activists, and educators are fighting back the 1619 Project, challenge traditional narratives by centering slavery's role in shaping America. Museums and historical sites now provide uncensored accounts of slavery's brutality. Digital archives, oral histories, and social media have become tools for reclaiming erased histories. The past is not just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. And the battle over history is, at its core, a battle over power. How should societies reckon with a past that still shapes our present? History is never neutral. The way we remember slavery, what is taught, what is erased, and what is distorted, shapes not only our understanding of the past, but also the policies and inequalities of the present. Reckoning with slavery is not just about acknowledging suffering, it's about confronting the institutions and systems that continue to profit from that history while silencing its full impact. For over a century, textbooks in the United States and beyond have systematically softened or erased the role of slavery in shaping economies, legal systems, and social hierarchies. The Dunning School, for instance, pushed a revisionist history that portrayed the Reconstruction era as a failure and justified racial segregation. The lost cause narrative transformed the Civil War's meaning in public memory, downplaying slavery as the central issue. Even today, debates over curriculum changes reveal deep resistance to teaching slavery's full truth, often under the guise of avoiding divisive concepts. Who benefits from these omissions? Beyond textbooks, economic structures that emerged from slavery, banking institutions that insured enslaved people, corporations that profited from forced labor, and families that inherited wealth from human chattel, still hold immense power. The post-slavery legal system ensured that wealth would remain concentrated among the descendants of enslavers. From redlining to racial wage gaps, the effects of this are measurable and ongoing. A serious reckoning means identifying these structures and demanding accountability. Some nations have attempted forms of reckoning. Germany, after World War II, directly addressed the Holocaust through education, memorials, and reparations. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided a public forum for testimony, though economic disparities remain largely unchallenged. The U.S., by contrast, has often chosen avoidance. Reparations movements have been met with resistance, and efforts at truth-telling are regularly dismissed as revisionist history. The question is no longer should societies reckon with slavery's legacy, but how will those in power respond when faced with undeniable historical truth? Will they acknowledge the role of slavery in shaping modern wealth and policy? Or will they continue to obscure the past for the sake of convenience? The answer will determine whether history remains a tool of the powerful or a force for justice. Slavery was never just an economic system. It was a carefully constructed machine of exploitation, built to extract labor and wealth while ensuring that those who profited would never be held accountable. What began as a system of forced labor in early European colonies soon became the backbone of global capitalism, shaping the rise of nations, industries, and financial institutions that still dominate today. This story reveals how European powers first experimented with racial slavery in the Canary Islands and sugar plantations before expanding their reach across the Atlantic. The so-called Age of Exploration was, in reality, an era of conquest, displacement, and mass human commodification. The Middle Passage remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, but the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade did not end in the hulls of ships. It evolved into an economic and legal structure that outlived slavery itself. In the United States, racial slavery became embedded in the very DNA of the nation. The plantation economy enriched not just the South, but also the North, where banks, insurance companies, and factories thrived on profits derived from enslaved labor. Laws ensured that slavery was not just a practice, but an institution, upheld by courts, enforced by violence, and justified by fabricated racial ideologies designed to dehumanize Black people while preserving white economic power. Yet this was never a story of passive suffering. The enslaved resisted in ways both seen and unseen, through revolts, sabotage, escape, and intellectual defiance. African traditions, agricultural knowledge, and labor skills transformed industries, even as the people behind these innovations were denied recognition. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves across the colonial world, proving that an enslaved people could overthrow their oppressors. But fear of this resistance led to harsher laws, tighter control, and new forms of racialized oppression even after legal emancipation. When slavery was abolished, the wealth it created was not redistributed. It remained in the hands of those who had benefited for generations. Convict leasing, sharecropping, redlining, and mass incarceration ensured that Black labor continued to be exploited, while barriers to property ownership, education, and financial access kept economic power firmly in the same hands. The generational wealth gap we see today is not accidental. It is the product of centuries of stolen labor, denied opportunity, and systemic exclusion. But history is written by those in power, and the truth about slavery has been deliberately distorted, minimized, or erased altogether. Textbooks soften the horrors, shifting the narrative to one of benevolent masters and a necessary evil. The Lost Cause mythology rewrote the Civil War's meaning, framing it as a noble struggle rather than a fight to uphold human bondage. Even today, efforts to teach an unfiltered version of history face fierce resistance, with lawmakers and school boards actively suppressing discussions on race and systemic inequality. The question we now face is not whether slavery still shapes our world. It does. The real question is, what will be done about it? Will those who continue to benefit from its legacy acknowledge the debt that history has left unpaid? Will there be reparations, institutional reform, or meaningful policy changes? Or will history continue to be rewritten to shield the powerful from accountability? Slavery is not just a chapter in the past. It is a force that shaped the present and demands reckoning. The story does not end here. It is still being written. As this story closes, one undeniable fact remains. The ghosts of slavery are not buried in the past. They live in the institutions, economies, and power structures of today. Reckoning with history means more than remembrance. It demands accountability. History is more than just a record of the past. It shapes how we see the present and influences the future. But how should it be taught? Should we focus on the broad political events, or should we dive deeper into the economic and human costs often left out of textbooks? What do you think? Should schools and media do a better job of addressing the realities of slavery and its long-term impact? Have you encountered history being misrepresented or erased? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. How should history be taught? And who gets to decide? Your voice matters in shaping the conversation. If you believe history should be told honestly without distortion or erasure, help us keep this conversation going. Like this video to support historical truth, subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the past, and share this with others who need to hear it. But most importantly, join the discussion in the comments. How should history be taught? What stories have been left out? Let's challenge the narratives, ask the hard questions, and make sure history is told as it truly happened. Your voice matters. Let's make history together.